All right, we're recording. This is Service API's meeting for August 13. And I wanted to go through we'll be doing this every meeting until we actually get to alpha release. I wanted to go through our release checklist and make sure that we're all on the same page here. I'm excited that I think we're making good progress on all remaining fronts here. TLS config, Harry has at least a couple PRs related to this in flight. Advanced routing, I know there's at least one PR that we'll talk about today in flight. Service level config, that's on the agenda for today. I think it's time to revisit that original doc and try to gain some consensus on which approach we prefer. I think it's reasonably close where we could go ahead and turn that doc into some kind of PR. The next step would be conflict handling semantics. I've got some updates there. I filed my first PR around this, I think yesterday. So I think we're making good progress as well. And then the last one would be cleaning up status and conditions, which will probably naturally fall later on this scheme as the API starts to stabilize. It'll probably be easier to clean up status and conditions. So I think we're in a good place. We're making some good progress. Not going to go over these today, but in office hours, I covered some of the PRs that had merged in the past week. And I think even since then, we've had at least a couple more that have gone in. So excited to see some more progress here. With that said, I should also mention, looking ahead to the next office hours, we have, Harry had this great idea to actually go back through and clean up all the stale PRs. I started that this afternoon, and so if I close one of your PRs that you are still invested in, by all means, don't hesitate to reopen, revisit the situation. But if things were stale and it looked like we'd already come to some other kind of resolution on the issue, I would close those PRs, and hopefully I gave you some background on rationale. But don't hesitate to reopen anything that shouldn't be stale. With that said, I think we should get into PR and issue triage. We've got a lot to cover today and not a ton of time. I do want to make sure we have enough time to get into service level config today. But there's some good PRs that I think could use our time first. So Harry has introduced this, I think, relatively straightforward PR, adding a mode and S&I matching for TLS config. Harry, do you want to give just a little bit more background on this one?
Yeah, this was last week, so I'm also sort of catching up on.
I can't quite hear you, unfortunately. You're coming through pretty quietly.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I also don't remember. So let's look at the diff together.
Yeah,
so
there was the.
Yeah, so this is not a big change, but this gets most of the TLS proposal in, except the TLS on route, and I think one minor change. But once we get this in, we'll send in the next years. But this one has the mode bet, which is either terminate or pass through, and if you terminate, the upstream connection can be plain text or TLS. That's something we will handle in service level config. And the TLS pass through is essentially you treat it as a byte stream, right? Like, so you can't really do anything inside the TLS protocol or inside the stream because the gateway cannot decipher it. So it adds this on the TLS config, which means it is added at the listener level inside gateway. So inside gateway, you have a listener, and each listener has a TLS config. So you have on the listener, the gateway layer, you figure each port, how do you want to handle TLS on that port, right? So the power lies inside, power lies with the cluster operator, I guess, whoever has right permissions on the gateway. If you scroll down a little,
I
another
do have a
change.
question on the mode. I see that the two options are terminate and pass through. Can you help me understand how we support the use case of Reencrypt, where the gateway terminates a session and then creates a new session to the
Yes.
backend service?
Right. So what this change deals with is the gateway deals everything with downstream TLS, which is between the client and the gateway. What should be the TLS setting is configured here. What should happen on the connection hub between the gateway and the upstream service is something we want to configure it later in the route level or even in the service level config. Uh, the reason and so once you terminate a TLS connection, then you can encrypt it with TLS or HTTPS, whatever your protocol be, uh, upstream.
Harry, can you maybe you already covered this, but describe in which context would it be possible to be flipping between these two? E.g.,
Yes.
like which configuration in which you can have both?
So on a port, you can either have terminate or a pass through. You cannot have both at the same time. And technically you can, and you can, based on the SNI, you can either pass through or terminate. Most implementations are not flexible enough to do that. The pass-through would usually be used for an SNI route or a TLS route, which is something we're not settled on yet.
I see. So this is more, I'm trying to think because it's interesting because this, one question I had would be like how this would be used. So for example, you would say it's TLS pass-through, but I still configure TLS, but I have an SNI. Basically, pass-through can only be used with SNI route, kind of.
Yeah, so SNI routing and whatever else is inside the SNI, sorry, not SNI, TLS client hello packet.
I see.
Usually
and
it's
then,
mostly like SNI routing.
So it's an interesting thing, like for the TLS pass-through, which aspects of TLS config are relevant there? Because you're passing it through by sniffing usually, isn't that how it works?
Yeah.
Like you can't, can you actually modify anything about the TLS?
No, that's the whole point. Like you're passing through TLS, so you're not supposed to do any. Like you can change anything at the TCP layer, but at the TLS layer, you are not supposed to like change one bit. So in that mode, TLS config, you only should configure the mode bit, right? And you cannot even configure like certificate, or you could probably configure like minimum TLS version, I think, and like to disallow traffic that's not compatible with your versions. But other than that, I don't think anything else is possible.
I see. So it would be only settings in the initial hello, and then there would be no, you really couldn't do anything other than just specify, basically like you reject it. Like that would be kind of,
yeah.
I see.
I mean, that's how it should be done. I don't know if there are implementations which exploit this further. I'm not aware of that.
So my question would be, why isn't, in that situation, wouldn't the list, why would it suffice for the listener just to be a protocol TCP, but you've attached an SNI sniffing route to it?
Yeah, so that's a good question.
Yeah, like why would you want that this versus that other one?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the reason for that is the gateway operator has to specifically configure each port as to how it should work, right? If you do a TLS pass-through and if you send it plain text TCP traffic or some other database traffic, it probably wouldn't work, right? Like without TLS. So it becomes the gateway operator's it comes under gateway operators control as to how they want each port to behave, right? Like if they expose a specific port as pass-through, then it like routes depend on the gateway, and they can like you can configure routes on that specific listener accordingly, but you cannot use any port that is configured as only TCP for SNI routing, right?
But wouldn't that, yeah, that's interesting. Like, let's say you had you expose like MySQL using L4 gateway, and then someone tried to like point their web browser at it. Wouldn't that be very similar?
That would
Like,
be, but it depends, right? So if you are using TLS in that case, you can still use a TCP-based port and do TCP-based proxying of TLS traffic or HTTPS traffic even, right? That is something simple that is already possible with TCP route and a TCP listener. If you want to use TLS in that case, then you have two options. You terminate TLS at the gateway, or you do SNI sniffing.
right, that's what I'm saying is that wouldn't that just, oh, I see. But wouldn't the protocol be TLS if you really wanted TLS termination? And then if you didn't terminate, it would be TCP. I'm just trying to understand the mode where you have TLS config pass through, trying to understand like why that would be different than just TCP with the SNI route.
Yes, so the reason for that is when the protocol is TCP, the behavior is much more encapsulated. Like when the protocol is TCP, we want implementations to mostly like without any custom extensions, not even look into the TCP stream and change anything, right? In case of pass-through implementations, we usually at least look at the first few bytes of the TCP connection, right? So that's why you have protocol as TLS, you have mode as pass-through inside TLS config, and then you have that behavior. If you have protocol as TCP, TLS doesn't even come into the picture. Like you can't do any TLS if you have protocol as TCP.
Yeah, I've heard DSA is the same. So
I see. But like, I understand it makes the validation easier because you can look at just gateway and see that attaching only SNI routes can be attached to it. Or is it a statement for, so like I can also see people using this sort of like they look at the gateway resource and then they are going to build things that behave differently based on the sort of the listener blocks that we're doing, because behaviorally it doesn't seem different.
You mean between TCP and TLS?
Yeah, the TLS config with pass-through versus just a TCP with a SNI route.
I see.
Maybe it's like a hint to the implementation to generate the right thing, and it's a little bit complicated if you have to go somewhere else to kind of figure out that it's a TLS pass-through.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So I think
I'm still 26, so I wasn't even.
It's mostly it's more of a hint, because if you do, like if you configure a TCP listener and attach SNI routes to it, it's also possible to land up in a situation where you have a TCP listener and you have a TCP route and a TLS route attached to it somehow. I mean, that depends on how we implement SNI routing, right? Like that's still, I think, open, and Jeremy has a PR for that. But we want TLS sniffing mode and a TCP mode to be incompatible. Like you have the concept of collapsible listeners or compatible listeners. I keep mixing those two, but
I see. So this is like a very explicit way to basically say you have to use one of these SNI based thingies because this is, so then the protocol would be TLS, but then the config would be passed through.
Correct. Because, and the reason is, if you have protocol as TCP and if somebody configures like a TCP route, which takes in all the traffic, but then somebody also configures TLS route, Now, some implementations can probably handle that because they will still try to predict that, these are the first few bytes of client hello and see if they can decipher it. If they can, they'll check the SNI and then route accordingly. If they cannot decipher it, they will assume that it's a TCP, like it's a custom protocol, and just pass it
Oh
through.
man.
So like people do that, and like supporting that in like such a generic API becomes painful, and like it's less predictable. Uh,
Right.
and,
I see. Okay. Yeah, it seems given that pass-through is quite a complicated thing, it may not be terrible. It's just like it feels like you can derive whether or not it's pass-through by looking at the whole object graph. But I guess this will be a more explicit statement about the pass-through. And maybe you could add some options, like it could automatically filter out TLS attributes. I guess that's my main thing, is like what could go in what else would be valid in that TLS config block besides this bit.
I think that's about it. I need to go back and check what else is present in client hello.
Yeah, like maybe you could do some filtering on version, or
I think
the Cipher suite maybe, is that in the hello?
Mostly working on
Cipher suite, I think client Cipher suites are in the hello. No.
I guess there's not, that block is not empty. Sorry, Daniel, I think we cut you off like a couple minutes ago.
That's fine. You bring up a good point. I actually commented in this PR that we should consider updating the docs for TLS config, that when pass-through is set, that all other fields are ignored. And Bowie, maybe to your point, Harry, if you find a use case, maybe options is one field, but otherwise, minimum version, certificate references, I just don't see why those fields would be applicable to pass-through. But back to my question about Reencrypt, I'm trying to understand I'm trying to kind of understand your response. So help me understand how we don't need to address that if it's a Reencrypt use case, that the gateway needs to have some type of reference maybe to a secret that contains the cert to use for the backend encryption, or some type of client TLS configuration that the gateway would need to make that TLS connection to the backend.
Yeah, I think Daniel, that is the proposal is to put it on the service side, because it's a description of the service, not a description of the termination.
So the service would have the client information, and then somehow the gateway, when it creates that TLS connection, it pulls that information from the service and then uses that to create the connection?
Yeah, I think that makes the most sense, because, for example, like you could have like a /search that only doesn't care, and then a / checkout that has specific TLS settings, or maybe it has different TLS settings, like more secure ones, or different certificates, or different mutual auth. So it seems like it's on, when you're going upstream.
Yeah, okay. I see
specific upstreams, yeah.
One comment to that, didn't you mention client TLS? So in case we are doing like mutual TLS or client authentication with the upstream service, that would have to be present at the gateway layer or probably somewhere, and we haven't touched on client TLS at all here. But just doing a plain, not a plain, I don't know what is the other name, like a regular TLS connection where the client verifies server's identity, but the server doesn't verify. In that case, you'll have like you will have your CA bundle on the gateway, and you just the gateway just has to know for each route the upstream protocol should be HTTP or HTTPS or TCP or TLS, right? And that information will be encoded on a per service level on the service of the server side.
Yeah, I could see some usability concerns where it's like, okay, you know, if the TLS connection is terminated at the gateway or pass through, you know, it's configured at the gateway, but if we want to do the re-encrypt, then you have to do that at the route level. Just, you know, having different areas that, you know, a user or administrator needs to figure out, okay, where do I configure this TLS information at? But that's probably just something that we need to kind of test and see what kind of feedback we get, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, they do, even though they both have the word TLS in it, they are describing two different things. So in some sense, it's not, it's like more straightforward, even though more verbose to have it be decoupled, because they are two, like they can move independently.
Yeah, I mean, this is all kind of server-side TLS, right? And you're saying it's at the route level that we would be dealing with the kind of the client-side TLS.
That's right.
Yeah, I'd always thought about the Reencrypt case being on the route. So you'd specify the gateway is terminating TLS, and then you make a separate decision about, you know, the transport protocol for the next hop. The thing that I do see maybe we could end up provisioning on the gateway is if the gateway has client certificates. I've had one person who wanted that. They were happy with a single client certificate per proxy, which seems like something that you might configure on the gateway or the gateway class. But I can also imagine, you know, it seems a little more complicated, but I can also imagine maybe you want to use a different client certificate per route or per virtual host.
Yeah, that's a good question of what the identity, I guess, is. Probably this, it feels like that is pretty obscure to use a different identity from the gateway out. So probably like 95% of use cases would just settle on like a given gateway has a single identity as it goes out. Yeah.
I hate to, this has been really helpful conversation. I hate to interrupt it, but there's a lot more to get through
I know.
today. And,
Sorry. So I think we'll take it to the comments. Generally, it seems okay, given pass-through is like a pretty advanced use case. So kind of making it extremely simple and kind of implicit probably doesn't give us much mileage. But yes, we can move on.
Yeah. And I should, Micaiah had a PR that had unfortunately gone stale, and I think I may have closed it today, but he linked it in chat. It's 81, and it was covering Reencrypt. I think we're also going to end up covering this when we get to service level config, but just keep that in mind. That's another PR that is relevant to this here. But yeah, we should get going. And speaking of PRs that I feel bad, they've gone stale and have not gotten attention. This one is another one by Micaiah that I think is reasonable, something we've talked about before. And somehow we missed providing much of any feedback on this. I don't know. I don't know how I missed this one. I'm sorry, but it seems reasonable. It's the idea that a route basically would have something in its status that would allow that would make it clear which gateways had accepted that route and were processing that route. I encourage everyone to take a look at this a bit further. I know it needs a rebase, but we've already talked about a similar concept here in terms of cleaning up gateway status, and it seems relevant. So I wanted to bring it to everyone's attention.
Should we?
Micaiah, did you?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
just maybe if there's like nothing super to highlight, then we can take it to the reviews. But Micaiah, do you want to say a few sentences?
No, I think Rob covered it. I'll rebase it, and I think it's straightforward enough. It just adds some useful status information, nothing too complicated.
Okay.
Okay,
Great, thanks. And the next one is mine, and I'll skip that. Again, just all of the rest are follow-up that we've already covered, and I think I'll skip them, but encourage everyone to take a look as a follow-up to this. But really wanted to get to service level config. It's related to our earlier discussion. This is a doc that I think Bowie started as a proposal. Maybe Bowie, do you want to give some background here?
So I think we went over this once. Probably we can just go through real quick. And actually, funny, that's relevant to the service level Reencrypt. It's basically what is the design pattern we want to use for things that are basically attached to the services. There's 2 or 3 different sort of axes, I guess. So the first one is, given that there's config that feels very much one-to-one with service, how do you make that association? So as before, we're saying like this project's going to be heavily using CRDs and creating like many of them. In that case, like when you create a CRD, how does the gateway controller know that this CRD corresponds to this service, right? So we had a couple of choices that's in the doc. The first one is it's the same name in the same namespace. There's another choice where it has a selector that selects a bunch of services. There's also, it has a reference that selects a service specifically without using a selector. And then there's some combination of those. I think one of the intriguing ones is to have both the first behavior by default and then potentially be able to reference things for some of the advanced use cases, which is like you might be running a gateway that you want to override the behavior of, but that we can kind of table that, but that's just kind of an example of things that you can get when you compose some of these techniques. The second one, I think, axis is basically how many CRDs do we want? Like, do we want one for all the core features and one for the extended features? And then, of course, you're free to extend them. So that's sort of up to you, or all the implementations at some level. Or do we want to basically go whole in on CRD explosion and basically have very focused sort of task-specific CRDs? So even in core, we would have like 5 CRDs, like one for health checking, one for timeout, one for TLS. And so that's like the second thing that we're talking about. I think, yeah, mainly it's like those 2 things. So kind of wanted to get feedback on how people felt about design choices in those 2. I think like either Yi or Rob or me was going to basically try to cobble together some examples to see how some of these design points actually look and feel. I think that's about it.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting idea. There's a lot to digest here. I know there's already been some great comments and discussion on this. One thing that I'll say just from the conflict resolution perspective, if we're talking about just how we might reference CRDs, assuming we had service-specific CRDs, the one-to-one match is admittedly the least powerful option, but it sure is simplest in terms of it's very hard to have a conflict. It gets really messy if more than one, say we have something called a service timeout policy. If multiple service timeout policies applied to a single service, it could potentially get very confusing. So this kind of one-to-one mapping does seem simple, at least. But I agree, this is a lot of potential CRDs to add and a lot of API expansion.
Even the CCSF project is.
Yeah, I'll open it up. Whatever anyone else thinks as well.
Things going on in it.
Yeah, I think we should have a relationship from service to these resources rather than these resources selecting a service, so that, you know, like Rob mentioned, and also you can still have the behavior where one resource is shared amongst services, like something like a default policy. But we also want like service owners to be in control of this.
I mean, I don't know.
RBAC becomes, I think, a lot simpler in that sense, especially because you cannot have relationship between objects using RBAC. So that's one comment, and second is, that's my personal preference, but I think we should try to not exclude CRDs. It's probably a matter of taste, but there has been reports happening that people also don't want to.
Yeah, it's funny because we have a version of this in our current ingress, we being the GKE, the Google one, and we do have the explicit mapping between service and the CRD. Yeah, we have to look at the feedback. Now I'm forgetting why we weren't as keen on this. I think it was just a little bit more complicated to explain. And the other thing was that you had to have it as an annotation on service unless we wanted to really edit service. So yeah, I think that was one of the key things. It was sort of seemed a little bit shoehorned in, given the annotation. But we do have fields that are official, quote unquote, annotations. So it's a good point, Harry.
Something I was thinking about that relates to both this and the earlier discussion is when you define a route, it can specify that the route should forward to multiple services, right? So some of these things with TLS could be kind of complicated, right? If you have a route that forwards to one service that's TLS and another that's not, that might present similar, there might be issues with some of these other parameters. Is that going to be a problem? I mean, you can define clear schematics, but is that going to make implementation kind of a mess?
Can you give a specific example? Because like a lot of proxies, you actually have that flexibility. It can terminate in TLS and then do whatever in the back, or it could terminate HTTP and then talk to a TLS service. Like which conflicts do you think will occur?
Not necessarily conflicts, but you can define one route that has actions to forward to multiple types of services, well, multiple services. And now we're saying this service might be a TLS service, or it might have this set of timeouts. And then this service might have a completely different configuration. So maybe it's a non-issue, but it just jumped out in my mind as this is a way that this makes things a little bit, it's a little bit surprising how complex this can make things on the implementation side when you have to take into account that this route might reference two very different services.
Yeah, that is a good question. Although like the server sort of proxy, reverse proxy implementations that I can think of, you end up having to create basically like an upstream representation for each of the services anyways. So it, at least the ones I know of, it's not like a surprisingly harder to kind of support a per upstream config. But then again, I don't know all implementations.
I think another thing that is interesting here that we haven't covered very much is this gateway route concept and what belongs on a route versus what belongs in this new kind of CRD or CRDs. As an example, I think that the TLS re-encryption, that kind of config does potentially make sense on service because it would be very tied to a service and probably consistent among everything referencing it. at least my understanding of that use case. Whereas something like a retry policy may potentially be something that would be, someone might want to be different per route or per environment. That seems like a real stretch, but I imagine there are some things that the same service you may want slightly different config for. Maybe that's a stretch, I don't know, but is there any kind of guidelines we have as far as what belongs on a route versus what belongs at this kind of service level config?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think like this is the same thing that we grappled with actually when we did our services one-to-one kind of thing, because it's very hard. Like one answer to that is, well, if it's different and it's one-to-one with service, then create a new service and then have another thing one-to-one. For example, let's say you had two different TLS configurations for the same, let's call it like application in the back end, right? Are they the same service with two different TLS configurations, or should you have two services with two different TLS configurations? We kind of settled on at the time that it felt like having a lot of different configurations around the same service was sort of like a fairly advanced use case, and therefore it was okay to kind of make it simpler and tie it to the service, which is kind of where the service decorator proposal comes in, versus trying to like basically push it up one level and then have like, you know, the same service, but basically composing it with like many different sets of configuration. I would love to hear all the rest of the implementers in terms of how they feel about that. That was kind of where the whole service decoration came in, as opposed to sort of pushing it into route. Now, there is a drawback to this, which is that now you have a lot of services that kind of alias the same thing, and you could lose that relationship.
Can you repeat the last part? What did you mean by that?
So like people attach many meanings to service. So if you ended up having the user sort of create multiple copies of the same service because they have different configurations, but they all alias the same workload. So if you had something that kind of talked about the workload from the service standpoint, I've seen feedback saying like, well, like that's really weird. I don't know specifically of systems that have been built on top of that assume that, but you can imagine that someone may have made that assumption.
I mean, that's even relevant with traffic splitting, as we have it defined right now, where you have two different services that are or multiple services being split, and it's essentially the same workload, different versions of the same workload.
The thing is, like, it's hard because the way Kubernetes works with all the selector stuff, you can't put things in a container. You basically like paint them a color and they can be multiple colors simultaneously. So it's like very hard to even not have aliasing at the work. Like there's no box that you can like put the lid on it in some sense. So it's it feels like it's something you can't avoid.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I totally feel that. Like we have a lot of users who break a workload into multiple services, and then the rest of their infra just sort of breaks. Like monitoring becomes a pain. What matrix you get from different sources becomes a pain. How other teams integrate. So it is definitely pain.
Yeah, like one thing is like, oh, maybe we should just tackle that problem, knowing that people can do aliasing, because you can't prevent people from doing aliasing. So then if you build things assuming there is no aliasing, then like necessarily things just blow up if they ever alias. And we know that the users always just do something like even just temporarily, right? You can just be editing one thing and then it kind of overlaps and then you fix it.
Well, thanks. Yeah, there's a lot to process here. It seems like we have a good start. I guess is the next step here either to get more feedback on this doc or just to try and turn this into some kind of PR with a best guess and iterate from there.
I think I would feel like we should just do a best guess, but at least that previous discussion we just had, probably I'll try to encode in like a concepts PR just to see written down, does it still make sense? Just given the sort of most common use cases, and then also like where does it live, the route, the service, or the gateway? I think gateway and route is pretty obvious, but like route and service, and what the rationale is there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great, thank you. Yeah, we are at time here. I will briefly mention I've made some relatively significant updates to this conflict resolution doc, and I have maybe inaccurately considered some proposed resolutions accepted. I think we had reasonable consensus on the ones I've listed here. If not, let me know. Add a comment here. I'm hoping to translate more and more of these to PRs over the next week. But I'll leave it at that because we're already over time. I'm also, a lot of these rely on a validating webhook or some concept of that. So I want to create an issue to track all the different use cases for a validating webhook. So when it comes time to actually build that, we have an idea of what it should be doing. And finally, just in terms of organization and making V1 Alpha 1 easier to understand and track, and you know, denoting whether issues or PRs are something that we want to accomplish as part of V1 Alpha 1, it seemed like we should look into milestone maintainers. So the process is in Kubernetes, there's a couple different PRs I need to make to one, add a list of maintainers, and then two, assign them the ability to maintain milestones, whatever else. At this point, I'm not sure who should be on that list or who wants to be on that list. So if you're interested, if you've been involved in this project and contributing, just maybe ping on Slack is the easiest way to volunteer, or well, we're already over time, so don't volunteer here. Yeah, just ping on Slack, and I'll try and get this this PR out with a set of maintainers, hopefully tomorrow, but sometime soon. And one note, you do need to be part of the Kubernetes SIGs org if you want to be a maintainer. If you're not in that, I'm happy to help get you there. So yeah, that's all I've got. I know we went over time. There's lots and lots of PRs to review and things to talk about. So let's carry on the conversation on GitHub. But yeah, thanks everyone for your time. This has been great.
Thanks, everyone.